Yeah, which goes hand in hand with growing your trademark reputation and, having that ability to distinguish your brand from those of others. Part of growing that reputation is, of course, by making sure no one else is diluting your brand reputation in a marketplace.
Like that's slide 10.
Yeah,
Register
true. Well,
registering your
number 3.
trademarks. That's a really important step.
Yeah, and it's one that most don't realize is important at the beginning, and it might only be clear to them that they need to register their brand once they run into an issue with someone else starting up a similar business under a similar name, and by that time they realize that it would have been handy to have those trademark rights already. Of course, then we can still start that process and see what options there are. But at the end, registering your trademarks at the beginning, or as soon as you're aware of the strength of having registered trademarks, is always a great idea.
I think the main thrust of it is when would now be a good time, so our sort of advice constantly from to clients is, as soon as you're settled on that name, as soon as you're settled on that trademark, on that logo, as soon as you're settled on that tagline or hashtag or whatever it might be that is really novel and unique, and think about it from this perspective: would you care if someone came along tomorrow and started, and use the same name or use the same or similar logo, or use some part of your name that was too close for comfort, that was confusing others? Then the answer is yes, you should trademark that, and you should do it as soon as possible, because the process takes 7.5 months at the moment, approximately, to finally get the registered trademark. Obviously you accumulate registered rights from the backdated to the date of the filing, but you don't get your certificate for 7.5 months later.
Yeah, it takes time.
When someone comes to you, when someone comes to us and says, oh, there's this person, infringing on our marks, and we need to trademark this stuff now, we have to break the news to them that, well, yeah, at the moment, you still have prior existing rights, and that's ultimately, usually the highest, power you can have, but not, having the registered trademark is just so much more fundamentally easier to prosecute, because you can avail yourself of the Trademarks Act.
Yeah.
We don't have to prove reputation in order to be a winner. But if you're relying on the Australian consumer law under misleading and deceptive conduct and tort of passing off, you kind of have to prove your reputation in the market, that and that people are going to be deceived. Whereas under the Trademarks Act, there's none of that. They don't, there isn't the case of, oh, we'll show us why your reputation is so big in the market that you're infringing this. This person is infringing your intellectual property rights, and that's the beauty of trademarks and registering trademarks under the trademarks.
Exactly. Once you have that certificate of registration, that's the base of your rights, according to the Trademarks Act. So reputation actually is almost irrelevant. It's all about just the extension of your rights and how you're applying them and how far they can go. And that decides how much reach you have and how easily someone else infringes your rights. But
also too, if you in an ideal world, you register the trademarks as soon as you're set on them, preferably before you go out to market. So you've got a filing date, just on the day that you're going out to market, you file registered trademarks as soon as you possibly can. Just to get that filing date. That's really important, to get that date from IP Australia. Then you've got something on the register that's time stamped and date, and no one going to take that away from you.
Yeah, because once someone else comes in before you.
After that. And because it's a first to use system that we have, but this sort of possession being 9/10 of the law, I'd much rather have the trademarks than somebody else coming in and trying to register them underneath them, and then you're having to make applications for, for to strike them off for bad faith or whatnot, which is never.
Yeah. I mean,
so
essentially, IP Australia doesn't check what use is already out there in the market. So it just complicates things if someone else already has tried to obtain trademark rights successfully or still pending before you. It just means that, more action has to be taken, even though the law will back you up in that sense. If you have prior rights, it doesn't automatically refuse anyone else's rights.
Much rather be coming from a position of having the registered trademark and being able to write the cease and desist letter to the enemy saying we have a registered trademark. Plus, we also have all this other stuff as well, which is and then we talk about misleading, deceptive conduct, passing off, etc. But at least we're coming from that position of even more strength. We've got the registered trademark for this, and the conversation, when we've advised clients that have received that type of correspondence, if the other side has a registered trademark or if they do not, sometimes can be very different, that conversation. But if they've got a registered trademark and they're coming from that position of power, and you're looking at this and advising them, and you're basically saying, oh, you're in trouble here, we need to get you out of this immediately, and the advice sometimes will be, you need to rebrand immediately, we need to get you, and we need to extricate you from this before they take you to the federal.
Yeah, exactly. And coming back to the slide, we do see the mistake often that some clients can think that by having registered a company or business name, domain name, or social media handle even for a certain brand, they have those rights already. But it really takes a registered trademark to be able to get those exclusive rights to a brand and monopolize your brand use in the marketplace in that sense.
Unfortunately, because it takes, and I'm going to labor on this for a little bit longer, because it takes that 7.5 months to register the trademarks, getting it done now means that in business land, 6 months goes like that, and then you suddenly have a registered trademark. Lots of our clients go, oh wow, that was fast, because I've got even though it was still the same amount of time. Things move fast in startup and small business landscape, or in business generally. How fast the years fly. And then you got the registered trademark, and then you've got it for 10 years. But it's really difficult when a client comes to us and really ought to have registered their trademark 6 months, a year, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 years ago, and now they're having to register the trademarks and pull themselves up by their bootstraps in order to register the trademarks. We then have to make a decision about whether we write the cease and desist letter to them now or after the trademark is registered, because obviously once you put the other side on notice that the trademark is in the process, they can potentially oppose the trademark and cause all sorts of problems. So this is the whole stitch in time saves 999,000 thing that I always say. Just better to get it done now and do it right. Stitch in time will save that down the track. And obviously, and two, it can be really distracting, really annoying, very costly, and attacking the business at its fundamental level, its brand. It can be really shaking, especially for a small business, that suddenly they may have to be thinking about the R word, not recession, rebrand, which is really tough to swallow, because they spend all this money, time, energy, and effort, and have a really big association with the brand, only to be told, oh, you're gonna have to change it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's look at our next point. Right?
Yeah.
Consider which brand features to secure.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, we just discussed. Yeah, we just discussed the big variety